Thanks, Benedict, agus Gramaga féin. Vorcéad fáilteteach a chuirde chuig agran iwwer trocha seacht de Blúiríní Béaloidis an podchéile ó cnúsach vidis an cláiste na Hóscoile baile á Lia. You're very welcome along to episode 37 of Folklore Fragments, the podcast from the National Folklore Collection, University College Dublin, which obviously, for all attending here, is coming to you this evening from the beautiful surrounds of the Museum of Literature Ireland in the historic UCD Newman House on St. Stephen's Green in the heart of Dublin, and also, which is very special, for the first time in front of a live studio audience. So, happy out. So it's a great pleasure, and thank you for being here with me this evening. And if you hear small children heckling, that's my son and daughter, toddlers, heckling me in the background, so excuse me, please. The aim of this podcast has been to present listeners with the richness, artistry, and depth of vision to be found in our folk traditions. And to this end, each episode to date has taken a singular fragment of that tradition as its primary focus. Holy wells, sacred trees, rites of passage, calendar observances, the house, and so on. And this format, while useful for our purposes, is necessarily somewhat artificial as an approach, for in our own lives, tradition rarely compartmentalizes itself so neatly, instead manifesting as a tapestry of many threads and a chorus of many voices which serve to keep the past present. This evening, however, instead of focusing on one aspect of tradition, we, for the first time, dedicate our explorations to one individual, namely Mairéad Peig Sayers, who, by her artistry and mastery as a storyteller in the oral tradition, skillfully managed to express the wisdom of the many in the wit of the few, and yet whose printed autobiographies, as Irene Lucchitti notes in an article in Folklore and Modern Irish Writing, experienced a decline in reputation, suffering critical disdain and schoolyard ridicule in equal measure. Now, nearly 65 years after her death, we hope to provide a platform through which her tales might find a new audience, one which it is hoped may find in her a source of inspiration and insight. And so, as Benedict was saying, it's a pleasure then for us to be able to announce that apart from this kind of mere podcast this evening, that our friends and colleagues at Molly, in collaboration with ourselves, will from next week, 6th of July, launch a 9-month-long exhibition on Peig Sayers and the Blasket Island storytelling tradition, and the context in which the priceless fieldwork collections of oral literature, which are held today in the archives of the National Folklore Collection at UCD, were recorded from that community by the Irish Folklore Commission. And with me this evening to explore Peg's stories, it's a huge honour to be joined by Pádraig Héalaí and Éilís Dhuibhne. As Ben introduced, let's run through the introductions again. Pádraig is a retired senior lecturer in modern Irish at National University of Ireland, Galway, and his area of specialisation is Irish folklore, and he has published on many aspects of the topic, including religious tradition, Blasket heritage, and beliefs and practices associated with the supernatural. He's a former editor of the journal Béaloidis, the Journal of the Folklore of Ireland Society, and with Buan Quist, he edited with Peig Sayers Laurhead le Coch, I Will Speak to You All, and Neil Derriraite, both of which have been recently republished by New Island, and again, as Ben said, are available in the bookshop downstairs, which is open late tonight. So there's only about 3 or 4 copies, so you can fight among yourselves. Where am I? Now, recently he edited Trí Inóg na Scoile, a young teacher's account of her experience of life in the great Blasket, which is still home to a vibrant community. Éilís Dhuibhne was born in Dublin, author of more than 30 books. Her works include The Dancer's Dancing, The Shelter of Neighbours, Cailíní Beacha Glán an Lá, and Her Lama Bach, among others. Her most recent books are 12,000 Days, a memoir, Little Red and Other Stories, and Look, It's a Woman Writer, Irish Literary Feminisms from 1970 to 2020. As well as being a writer, she's a folklore scholar and has written extensively on aspects of traditional narrative. She's been the recipient of many literary awards, most recently the Penn Award for an outstanding contribution to Irish literature. In autumn 2020, she held the Burns Scholarship at Boston College. She's a member of Éilís and president of the Folklore of Ireland Society. So you're all very welcome to Blúiríní, and please put your hands together for our guests. I'm just going to start a brief reading from An Old Woman's Reflections, Machnamh Seanad Ná, just Seamus Ennis's translation. We'll start at the end. This is from the last chapter, and this is Peg. She says, "My spell on this little bench is nearly finished. It's sad and low and lonely I am to be parting with it. Long as the day is, night comes, and alas, the night is coming for me too. I am now at tight grips with the I'm now at tight grips with the years, and many a thing I saw. Everything I was interested in, I didn't let it astray. Someone else will have a pastime out of my work when I'm gone in the way of truth. A person here and a person there will say maybe, who was that Peig Sayers? But poor Peg will be the length of their shout from them. This green bench where she used to do the studying will be a domicile for the birds of the wilderness, and the little house where she used to eat and drink, it's unlikely there'll be a trace of it there. Pádraig, I wanted to start with you this evening for a conversation. You have an intimate connection with the Blasket Island and with Peg, not just through your research that you've done and published in the area, but by virtue of the fact that your mother taught on the island and that you yourself met Peg shortly before her death. So I was wondering, just to start, if you could maybe help answer the question that Peg asked of who was that Peig Sayers and what life maybe was like on the Blaskets.
Yeah, well, Peg was a very sort of likely person growing up to become the famous person that she is now becoming and being more and more appreciated. She was the son of a small farmer, and she was the youngest in the family, and her youth was somewhat precocious in the sense that she had a great interest in storytelling, and her father was a noted storyteller, and he used to go visiting to other houses in the vicinity, and Peg would come with him, which was not a usual thing for a child to do, really. And Peg, from her very early age, if you like, she was learning her craft. She was really interested, and she was able to bring with her some of the stories and the other oral material that was being given as entertainment in houses. Peg herself then, when she was about 14 years of age, because of poor family situation and sort of a household in which there wasn't great harmony. Her brother had married, and his wife wasn't very kindly disposed towards her. So she went into service in a shop in Dingle, which is still thriving as a pub and a general merchant, and a bit of a farm attached to it as well. And Peg, at that early age, had to do really hard work, working with animals, keeping the house clean, and as well as that then, she was sort of entertaining the children in the house. And she was lucky in that house in that the owner's mother was a fluent Irish speaker herself, and she was able to make Peg feel at home and encourage Peg to tell stories and give pieces of verse and songs maybe to the children in the house. Will I continue on her life story, or what should I do?
Because she's so associated with the Blasket.
Yeah, she is.
She didn't. She was born on the mainland. She went into the island, kind of Harbalach.
Yeah.
So I suppose, if possible, to give.
Okay, we look from her home in Dunquin. Let's say the Blasket Island was a daily sight for her. It was just a few miles out in the sea, a small little island, and when she felt the need to leave home permanently and go somewhere else where she could have, a happier life, her first aim was to get to the United States of America. And this was the dream of many young boys and girls in the area at the time. And Peg was bitterly disappointed when that didn't materialize for her. There were a couple of young men in the parish, which she has said that she would be very happy to marry either of them, two of them especially. But her father couldn't afford the dowry to enable them to get married, and then she was happy to accept an offer of marriage from a Blasket Island fisherman. And she then subsequently went to live on the island, a rather sort of daunting experience for somebody raised on the mainland, but nonetheless she settled in easily enough and made friends with a number of the married women on the island especially, and gradually, because of the yearly inflow of visitors, scholarly visitors, people who really valued what the culture of the Blasket Islands, she became sort of better known. People would come to her to hear her tell stories and also to improve their Irish and so on. So she began to acquire sort of a profile as a storyteller. And this blossomed, and a number of scholars sort of really were instrumental in making Peg sort of internationally known, you could say. People like, for instance, Robin Flower, who was curator of manuscripts in the British Museum, and Kenneth Jackson, professor of Celtic Studies subsequently in Edinburgh, and then others like also Heinrich Wagner and a number of other sort of well-known scholars in the area of either language or folklore. And because of the focus which they brought to bear on Peg, Peg became a person whose name was associated very much with being an oral tradition bearer and somebody who had unusual prowess in telling stories and an unusual grasp of the tradition which she had inherited. She knew so many different areas of traditional lore. She was really very au fait with, thinking of things like, for instance, medicine, cooking, and songs. She had many songs. She wasn't a great singer, but she said herself she had the voice of a crow, but she knew the words and so on. So that may be sort of some sort of a lame introduction to who Peig Sayers was.
No, it's great.
Or is, yeah.
One of the things you mentioned there, her ability or skill as someone who was part of an oral tradition of storytelling as well, and that's something Éilís, I wanted to ask you about, because one of the probably the thing that like Peg is most associated almost as a book as opposed to a person almost. She's associated with her autobiographies, with printed works in many ways.
Yeah.
But she was through and through a storyteller in the oral
yeah.
tradition.
I mean, clearly she's best known in, I suppose, what you call popular modern Irish culture as for her memoir, Peg Sayers, which came out in 1936 first, but went on the curriculum in secondary schools in 1962 and was on it till 1995, I think, and was hated by many school children. We might talk about. I mean, when I was thinking about that, 1962, what timing from the Department of Education, like you know Philip Larkin's little poem about. The sexual revolution began in 1963, which was just too late for me between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. That's when Peg is foisted on the teenagers of Ireland who are, modernising faster than probably at any other time in our history, even since then. Anyway, Fogami Chin Marahoshe, but of course, the reason that she even wrote the memoir, I suppose, was that she was already established as a great storyteller, as Pádraig has been telling us. She was a gifted woman. I mean, the evidence is that she's in the top 10 or top 5 of great storytellers internationally simply on account of the quantity of material which she actually knew. She had an extraordinarily good memory and ability to retain all this material, all the stories. So, and she could tell them very well. And she was already, by 1936, she went to the Blasket in 1892. That's when she married Patsy Flint, her husband, Pádraig O'Caheen. She was just 19, I think, 18 or 19. And she had 10 children. She was obviously busy. 3 of them died in infancy. But from the early 1900s, I think the collectors and the linguists and the scholars and the Fowlamori Gaeilge and so on are beginning to go to the Blasket, and Peg and Tomás Ó Cruthain, author of The Island Man, which the publication of which no doubt had an influence on Peg and her memoir. They were coming to the island. They were Peg and Tomás were known as particularly good people to go to if you wanted to polish up your Irish, because they spoke apparently with great clarity. She has an enormous vocabulary, as I find out when I'm going to the stories and trying to translate them. I mean, there are a lot of words that I need to consult. Janine is the best, I think. She was famous. We'll talk about the collectors probably in a few minutes. Pádraig has mentioned a few of them, but they were coming from far and wide, from Dublin, of course, and various parts of Ireland, but also from Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, naturally, and yeah. England, not to forget England, Robin Flower and Kenneth Jackson, and so on. So she was well known and gifted. And now I forget what the original question was.
Me too, that's right. No, I suppose I'm just trying to bring out the point or the sense which people mightn't necessarily understand or be aware of, just the vast store of folk tales, wonder tales, and like Pádraig you'd mentioned, just kind of local historical lore knowledge that she had, because she's so renowned or infamous, depending on who you ask her, about the her memoirs.
Yeah, the memoir. There are a few of them, but well, of course, we're folklorists and may have a certain bias, but I would think they are the least significant of that's not to denigrate them entirely by any means, but really her importance is as her genius was for storytelling. I mean, she's a contemporary, when you think about it, of James Joyce.
I'd never thought about this.
And I always, who's closely associated with Molly.
There he is.
And there's, there he is. Yeah, that guy. And but he's young and Peg. I mean, we tend to look at Peg, and she emphasises it in the book and so on as kind of always ancient, but she was young, she was beautiful. There aren't that many photos of her in her youth for obvious reasons. I suppose people weren't taking photos. I think it's Carl Wilhelm von Sydow, the great Swedish folklorist, father of the more famous Max, who was a good photographer. He took the first photos of Peg, and that's in 1916 or 17. Well, before the war, clearly. I can't remember the exact date. But so there is that. But she was. I think it's kind of useful to think of her in that context. We recognise Joyce, obviously, because he was a great genius, but he's a writer, he's working in the literary tradition, he's working in the newer language in Ireland, English, he's going abroad. Peg never goes anywhere. She's her first language is Irish. She's at home on the Blasket Island. The world comes to her. Joyce goes out to the world, and Peg is operating in the older tradition, which, as Boo Alquist, my husband and our friend and the great folklorist too and great expert on Peg, would always say, literature is the tip of the iceberg. and under the literary tradition is, for centuries, our literature in Ireland and in the world was the storytelling and the oral. So I feel Peg is just in a completely, in that older tradition, on a par almost at the level of skill, and that with her coeval there when the wall changed
Him over
choice.
there. As though we'd planned it, just want to bring in Boo from the introduction to Mairéad Peig, where he talks about, I suppose, not the tension necessarily, but just the dichotomy between the kind of the printed material, the written material, but then the oral tradition of which she was a part. He says here, in spite of all the qualities to recommend them, it might be argued that the greatest importance of the autobiographies is that they form part of the reason why more is known about Peig than almost any other Irish woman of her time. For although Peig has become so well known that many people do not regard Peig as a person but as a book, the reality is that her real importance does not lie in the printed pages in the autobiographies she dictated to her son, which is something that people aren't necessarily aware of as well. She dictated the text as opposed to writing them, but in her incredibly vast store of stories and tales. In other words, instead of being a book or even an author or writer in the usual sense of the word, her greatness lies mainly in her oral artistry. Neither were the stories in which she excelled of her own invention, nor were they mainly about herself or about recent events. They were instead traditional stories passed on for generations by word of mouth, many of them with roots hundreds or even thousands of years ago, but on which she put her own stamp, infusing them with her own personality, worldview, and life experience. In quantity, quality, and variety, these tales of Peig's far surpass her autobiographical books. The manuscript material deriving from her in the National Folklore Collection at University College Dublin alone occupies about 5,000 pages, to which a not inconsiderable amount of printed material from other sources is to be added. Though these collections include material other than traditional stories, it is these that form by far the greater part of them. Peig's story repertoire is often stated to have included 375 tales, and this figure may well be more or less correct, which is a slightly kind of mind-boggling concept, I think, for people in a modern context to have memorized and inherited 375 separate different types of wonder tales, local legends, and so on, and then to be able to recite them with the skill and artistry that she did. So it's something that's I suppose that's worth bearing in mind. What sort of, I suppose, actually briefly, to go to you mentioned Robin Flower, Éilís. There's an account, a little kind of vignette that Robin Flower provides in his book, The Western Island, which is a beautiful book, which everyone should have. There isn't any for anyone in the audience, but it says here, he's describing her telling the story, and he says, as Peig was telling this tale, I watched her in admiration of her fine, clean-cut face, with the dark, expressive eyes that changed with the changing humours of her talk, all framed in her shawl that kept falling back from her head as she moved her arms in sweeping gestures, only to be caught and replaced above her brow with the twitch of the hand. So, I suppose in thinking about the stories and tales, Pádraig, I wonder if you could take us through maybe what sort of tales that Peig had in her repertoire. What sort of traditional stories did she have?
Yeah, okay. Before I do that, I'd just like to come back again to what Éilís and yourself there had touched on, Johnny.
Yep.
Namely, sort of the role Peig's autobiographies has played in presenting her persona to readers and so on. And I think really that her autobiographies have done her a disservice in the sense that people have tended to view these as sort of the summation of Peig's prowess as a storyteller, or alternatively as her ability as her talent as a writer, which was worse again. But her real talent lay, and the reason why it is entirely proper for us to appreciative of her and to be proud of her talent is in her storytelling. That was really her forte. Now you asked me to say something about the types of stories that she had. Well, as you would expect, maybe from somebody who had a repertoire of 375 tales, it covers quite a gamut of storytelling. You have international folk tales, you have migratory legends, you have romantic tales, you have religious tales, exemplary tales, and you also have verse tales and tales of the supernatural. And it's really a very rich collection, if you like, of the stories available in Irish oral tradition. It's quite even she had 3 Fenian tales, which was quite unusual for a woman. The women didn't generally tell the Fiannicht stories. So Peg's repertoire was quite extensive, and like as Bo said, it's not, quality is not the same as quantity is not the same as quality, and in Peg's case that is true. We can just listen to her telling the stories, and you sense immediately she wants you to listen to this story. She wants you to know about what she's going to tell you, and she wants you to believe it also. Then the manner in which she deals with the development of the storyline, say the attention she pays to detail. This is what makes her stories longer than many other tellings of the same story, because she enriches it with rather detailed descriptions, which are not necessary for the story, but to create the image and the mental picture of what she's saying. This is her way of doing it, and she did it very effectively.
Just to echo what you described. There's again in the intro to An Old Woman's Reflections, it describes this kind of a storytelling occasion in Peig Sayers' home, which I just want to read through because it brings across what you're kind of describing there. It says, "I wish I had the ability to describe the scene in Peig Sayers' home in Dhuibhne on a winter's night when the stage was set for the Shanachie," writes Joseph O'Donnell, Joe Daly, who was one of the full-time collectors for the Folklore Commission, who collected from Peig from the 1940s on. Writes Joseph O'Donnell, "The evening meal was over, the day's work done, the family rosary finished. On the hearth glowed a small peat fire, and on the side wall was an oil lamp. So on the side wall, an oil lamp gave a dim light. Peg dominated the scene, seated on a low chair right in front of the fire. This was most unusual in the locality. Banatee, the woman of the house, usually seated herself at the side and smoking her pipe. Micheál, her brother-in-law, sat with his bamps to the fire at one side of her, and Mike, her son, at the other. When the visitors arrived, for all gathered to the Sayers' house when Peg was there to listen to her from supper time till midnight, the chairs were moved back and the circle increased. News was swapped, and the news often gave the lead for the night's subject: death, fairies, weather, crops. All was grist to the mill, the sayings of the dead and the doings of the living, and Peg, as she warmed to her subject, would illustrate it richly from her repertoire of verse, proverb and story. Often her thoughts would turn to sad topics. She might tell, for instance, of the bitter day when the body of her son Tom was brought home, his head so battered by the cruel rocks he had fallen off from the cliff that his corpse was not presentable to the public. So Peg, with breaking heart, had gathered her courage together and with motherly hands had stroked and coaxed the damaged skull into shape. It was difficult, she would say, and then, with a flick of the shawl she wore, she would invoke the name of the Blessed Virgin, saying, 'Let everyone carry his cross.' I never heard anything so moving in my life," a Kerry man confessed to me, as Peg Sayers reciting a lament of the Virgin Mary for her son, her face and voice getting more and more sorrowful. "I came out of the house and I didn't know where I was." Great artist and wise woman that she was, Peg would at once switch from gravity to gaiety, for she was a light-hearted woman and her changes of mood and face were like the changes of running water. As she talked, her hands would be working too. A little clap of the palms to cap a phrase, a flash of the thumb over her shoulder to mark a mystery, a hand hushed to her mouth for mischief or whispered secrecy. So it gives, I suppose, a certain impression of a living tradition of which she was very much not just a part, but a kind of, I suppose, excelled in the high artistry of. And so again, it's just important to bear that oral tradition in mind when we're thinking about it. And to move maybe from I suppose, from what Joe Daly describes, Éilís, I wondered if you could talk a little about her audience. Like, who is she telling these stories to?
I think she had three kinds of audiences. She told scary stories to children. I think Pádraig writes about that, ghost stories and that kind of thing. She told scary stories to grown-ups as well. Some of them are quite full of bloodshed and violence and so on. But then she told them, of course, to the collectors and the scholars and the linguists and these people who were coming to the island and to Dunqueen, I guess, later. Joe Daly was collected almost exclusively in Dunqueen from Peg in Dunqueen from 1942, when Peg moved over back to Ballyvicora, where she was from, on the mainland, and Joe Daly, collector for the Irish Folklore Commission, was also in Dunqueen. He visited Peg 275 times during the about 10 years he was working. So there were those people, and then the community. And I mean, Joe is describing a situation there where he was probably collecting from her, but the neighbours all gathered in to hear the stories. And I imagine that happened a lot on the island as well, with the earlier, collectors, Robin Flower and Kenneth Jackson and so on, Mary Louise Chestet, all the people who came to her. I think that's very interesting. The tradition was still there, the real tradition of storytelling. There was still not much else to do. I guess you had to provide your own entertainment until the 50s or the 60s. There was no electricity even on the Blasket Island. So storytelling and music and singing would have been the equivalent of watching telly on a Sunday night. It's often Sunday night, I think, that they do the storytelling. I always imagine that's when it is. So I think it's a kind of interesting aspect of that time when the tradition is on the cusp of changing. And, Micheál O'Caheen, Peg's son, also became a great storyteller, but he didn't tell stories to the community. I think he told them mainly to Boo Alquist and to other collectors and so on. But he became a writer. I mean, he was a poet, and he wrote novels and collection of short stories and memoirs and so on. That in the next generation, that transition from the oral narrative community to the literary community had already happened in the Gaeltacht in Kerry. So I think what you get in Peg's stage is the tradition is still alive, but it is being fanned up and nurtured to an extent, maybe to a great extent, by the collectors and by the interest that the Stone-Cherry, the outsiders, are showing in the culture. I think that's an interesting part of it. It's a complex issue now. Should you just leave everything alone to be natural, or do you come in and what do you do to it? Yeah. But I think it's beneficial in the context, in the case of the Blasket Island.
Yeah, like in when Peg was, let's say, in her prime, let's say in the 30s, 40s and so on, the young people on the island, storytelling had kind of gone in as an entertainment, had fallen down to the level of children. And the young boys, anyway, I know from people who told me who were young men on the island at that time, that they wouldn't dream of going listening to these stories, that this was something for children only. Yeah. So it's interesting that you can see how sort of the tradition is falling down in esteem, as it were. Storytelling is something for kids. But of course it continues.
Yeah. As though we had planned it. Ian, do you mind playing? We have a piece of audio, and it's actually, it's Peg is talking about storytelling on the Blasket. So she's not telling a story as such. This is an interview much later on with Pádraig and Shauach and Sean O'Sullivan from the Folklore Commission, and they're talking about the context in which things were occurring. It should be Aroníocht and Scéalaíocht, number 10. And if you can stop playing it after like 1 minute and 42 seconds, because it goes on for 7 minutes. And also, no, that's all.
Kun ons nog zien van nemen, je de stiegen van mijn heen de gierig.
Oh, wie nog die nogen, wie vast zoals wie die vellen hadden, die vellen lopen voor de wallis weer gelacht op. Gelacht zijn maar daarvoor, als een zo'n chandrine. Wie gescoreerd de dood te gelen.
Ik had die die schinnen wie die dood te gelen. Dat die vast, dat die post.
Weeg naar de post, naar de ogen, naar de post. Wie die scherinken, als ze worden, als ze dan op gedacht, als ze de gelen.
Ach, meer skillichtige zo aan.
Wie sensitieve, we meer naar de eerste. Als we het aardig heel dan met schachtenis dan met die, dat we oeraanzicht. Als gedachte. Die jaar die gewoon is.
Meer tegen aardig vindt altijd van de gedachten.
Nee, wie.
Aftallo hink.
Schijn tegen wind ook voor je. Maar niet op tegen moeren naar de naar farsen nou.
Ach, er een skillige font en de laan het lientje. Van Shanna skilte.
Nee, red. Nere we tanachie aan wie aborteren skills niet de marsje ra ach herkelen wie omheen Pádraig ook heen wie ze gewoon toch alles kauwer session skilta hoog zeet o wintri bra hij weer gedacht dat ze nou zijn egieskach klamach gedient laat wintri hij ivraig.
Is het crucial?
So I have a translation of that here for people who don't speak Irish. Pádraig says to Peg, how did you spend the time at night, in the winter nights? And she replies, well, the young people who were grown up used to be in a particular house. They had particular houses throughout the village where they enjoyed themselves, having their own fun, as you might say. The old people then used to visit together. And then Shauach says, what did the adults, the married folk, do when they got together? The married folk, the young people who were not married, used to dance and sing and have fun and banter. And then Shauach goes on, was there storytelling and singing? Yes, in the houses where the adults were. On certain nights of the week and of the year, there was always singing and fun in some house. And then Shauach asks, were certain houses chosen for this entertainment? It went from house to house. Yes, a particular house would be chosen as there were no big, fine, spacious houses on the island. Were there any good storytellers on the island who told the old tales in your time? No, there was only one storyteller who was able to tell any of those Fenian stories. My own husband, Pádraig. He was wonderful. And where did he get his stories? He got them from the Ivrahach people, O'Shea's from Ivrahach, who used to come to the island in those days fishing lobster. So it gives, I suppose, a certain a sense of the state of tradition, which in a way maybe has gone into a state of kind of anachronistic decline in a way, and it's kind of ebbing away in a certain sense. And yet it was providing a huge amount of inspiration for the likes of the Folklore Commission and visiting scholars from abroad who saw, I suppose, the last fragments of a living tradition and the last kind of, I suppose, expressions of the Gaelic storyteller in that context.
Well, the last fragments, I mean, they came because the tradition was so much richer in Corcagina and in Dungreen and other places as well as the Blasket Island. I'm not sure if, and you know, that was still the case in the late 1950s when Delargy told Boo Alquist to go to Kerry because he was, interested in folklore in the context of Europe, and that Ireland was the place where you could still hear the stories, the international tales that had been known all over the continent, that they were still being told. So I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it was. I wouldn't say it was on his last leg.
it wasn't,
And it's interesting that she says in this interview, she because Patsy Flint is kind of shadowy figure I feel in the story of Peg, but she did learn a lot of stories from him, from her husband, and then the other great source was her father. She heard them from many other people, but from those two sources. I don't think it's entirely true that there were no storytellers. Dhuibhne Kennedy was telling stories. I mean, she's in the Western Island and so on. So it may be, she does say Fenian tales. There was a certain, I think they were the kind of, these stories.
Yes.
So, and women were not allowed to tell them, but there's an interesting little scene in the Western Island where Dhuibhne is telling a version of Cinderella, and a man comes in and says, we wouldn't have called that a story at all in our day. And Boo writes somewhere, Mihal, there are 5 or 6 versions of Cinderella type stories, very good ones too, called different things, Maureen and so on, by Peg. But Mihal O'Griheen refused to tell any of those. He wouldn't tell. He said, they're too Cinderella-y.
I think in Peg's reply that there were no great storytellers. I don't know what she's trying to downplay the opposition or what.
The queen of Irish storytelling.
I know that storytelling continued as entertainment for adults right into the 50s, I know. There were certain villages in my own area where going to the national school, the young boys from those villages would come in and tell us about the great night they had listening to the stories, and it would very frequently have been either a heroic tale or skilfully, and as Éilís said, sort of the Fenian tales. This was really sort of senior hurling storytelling. This was the high point of the art of storytelling was displayed in the Fenian tale.
And who were the collectors who first noted or kind of looked to the Blasket as a special case, as it were, for senior hurling and other pursuits? Like, who were the first scholars who visited her?
Yeah, well, there was a school of Irish learning established in Dublin in 1908, sort of. And scholars, linguists from other countries used to come and study Old Irish, basically, at this during summer course. And the director, Osborne Bergen, he had a strong sort of inclination towards Munster Irish and Blasket Island, and he urged his students sort of to go to the Blaskets. And this is how Robin Flower, for instance, ended up going to the Blaskets in maybe around 1910 or something like that. And subsequently then he urged Kenneth Jackson to come, and this sort of set the trend, as it were. Like the Blasket Island was really very lucky in the kind of tourism that developed in it, that it was not at all destructive of the local culture. In fact, it was very helpful in reinforcing it and in giving the local people to understand that their way of living and their way of talking and so on was worthwhile and good, and was really something that people in Dublin and England and elsewhere sort of admired. So it had a beneficial effect like that.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think it was the respect that the people of the Blasket Island and of the Gaeltacht in Kerry got for their own culture and their language and so on was so nurtured and inspired by these visitors. But the Blasket phenomenon, it begins in the early 1900s. Synge went in 1905, I think. He could have met Peg, she was there, but he was only there for a night or two. And then Karl Marstrander, the Norwegian, that's an interesting story. He was a great linguist and more than a folklorist, I think. Was he a folklorist as well? But he was also an athlete, and he was actually on the Norwegian pole vaulting team for the Olympics in 1907. I think the Olympics were in London in 1907. But instead of going to the Olympics, he decided, I will go to the Blasket and learn Irish, which he did. He spent 3 months there, and at the beginning he didn't know, he says he didn't really know any Irish much, but at the end of the 3 months he was leaf galore. He was able to express himself well.
Did he pole vault over the houses?
He pole vaulted over to Musgrave's house. Yes. He was obviously a character. And then many people visited the Blaskets. I think an interesting character who had an influence was somebody called George Chambers, very mysterious because he went in, I think, 1931, just once, and he became friendly with a Blasket Island girl called Éilís and in 1978, she wrote to him then. She wrote letters to this George Chambers. He lived in London for about 20 years. She married one of the O'Crihans and moved to Maria Sean O'Crihan. I was hunting for her. She was born in 1911. She was a beautiful girl. You'll see photographs of her in the exhibition. But she I couldn't find out anything about George Chambers. Like, who was he? All we know in the books was that he lived in London. But today, somebody sent me an email, and he's found out, my colleague, old friend and colleague, Jerry Long in the National Library, George Chambers was the sales manager for a company that manufactured Christmas crackers. What was he doing on the Great Blast?
Heard it here first.
But all kinds of people went, apart from the ones, the great learned people. But over a dozen people collected stories from Peig Sayers over the years, and how many others visited her and talked to her. So there'll be information about a good selection of them in the Molly exhibition that's going to open next week here.
And then,
just Peg's relationship with the scholarly visitors, let's say, is interesting. I like to think of her as sort of a foster mother to the study of Irish studies and folklore studies, in that she influenced very much Robin Flower. Like, he saw from her the effect of a story which could have been told in medieval times, well told, and how it sort of would make an impression on people. And with Kenneth Jackson again, like, he dedicated his perhaps one of his best known books to Peig Sayers, sort of acknowledging the contribution that his contact with her had made to his scholarship. So it isn't sort of entirely, I think, inappropriate to view her something as a shady, let's say, foster mother or to Irish learning and folklore studies.
Didn't she write to Kenneth Jackson as well? The letters. We have them, see 3 letters, and one of them says that she has a mother's love and respect.
That's right.
And he wouldn't. What was he? He couldn't. There's a letter from him later, I think, is it Taboo, saying that he couldn't go back to the Blasket. He didn't want to go back to the Blasket to spoil the perfect memory he had at that time with her. And we have photographs of them on the island and laughing away. You can see.
Yeah, she got on. She obviously loved them. I mean, she loved the company and the attention, and she was. They were calling her the queen of storytellers, and the Queen of the Blasket, and she sparkled up. Reid Mahan, who was worked as an archivist in the Irish Folklore Commission and the Department of Irish Folklore for many years, is a little bit admiring, but a little bit acerbic about Peg. She writes about her in Bree's memoir, which is called The Grass Grows Green. Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, and her account of her meeting with Peg is, I think she says Peg sparkled up and flirted with the men. She loved that. And she was polite, but not all that, that interested in Breed Man, apparently, in women. But she does say, I just read this fantastic description Breed Man has of her. She met her, she was in her 70s, an old woman with a face scarcely lined, dark expressive eyes and hands, and a wonderful voice. Listening to her, I thought that in another place or time, she might have made her name as a great actress. In looks, gesture, and timbre of voice, she reminded me of Siobhan McKenna, our own Sarah Bernhardt. So, and I think that's quite an insightful, Peg had the talents of a creative writer, but also of an actor, which is perhaps what a storyteller has to have. You have to have that combination.
The flirtatious side of Peg comes out in a letter she addressed to a law student who was on the Blaskets and sort of visited with Peg, I'm sure daily, improving his Irish. And when he goes back to Dublin, he must have given her some present or something, and she writes a letter, and she addressed the letter on Buachel Allen, 39 Kenilworth Square. So I think you can read into that.
I suppose as well, she inspired and impacted on not just international kind of scholars and collectors of folklore, but also on Irish writers and poets and so on. There's another description from the introduction to Laird the Coch here I want to read. And it's Sean O'Riordan's words regarding her. And it says here, this is a rendering of how the poet describes Peg sitting in her bed in Dingle Hospital, very much as she was when Sean McRaman made his last recordings of her. And this is Sean O'Riordan's description of her. He says, there she would be, sitting up in the bed with a large shining cross on her bosom, such as a clergyman might wear. Despite being bedridden for such a long time, her heart seemed to be as light as a starling, as she used to say herself. Although blind, she was always the brightest in any company. There was a certain radiance in her face as she spoke to you, so that you were unaware of the lack of light in her eyes. Her face spoke to you, just as sighted people speak to you with their eyes. What would the face be saying? That it was Peig Sayers herself, and not anybody else who was talking to you. That old Peg warmly welcomed you because you were one of her own. That you were both of a noble race. That you both were aware of the nobility of the Irish language. That you understood the generosity, the roguery, the mystery, and the sorrow of this world better than anyone else. That your meeting with her here was a matter of universal joy. Her face said that and much more. So I suppose there's a description of her. There are many different descriptions of the impact she seems to have on those who are in her company and who see her sharing stories with them.
Sean O'Riordan has a very good description of, he describes Peg's mind as a canvas, a naivog omprinchen a canvas boat in which we navigate the sea of our tradition. That she was so knowledgeable in it that she can steer us through it.
So how do you think that we should maybe view her today? I mean, we've covered different angles of her artistry, but I think maybe the view, the kind of eye-rolling meme that people would have associated with her in years past, I think is diminishing now. I think people are more open to kind of a reappraisal of her. But is there any way, how should we think of her today?
Well, more realistically, I think, like she has got a bad press generally, I think, or at least the bad press has been given wide publicity. Like, she was not at all a puritanical woman. She was fun-loving. And her sort of, some of her stories, for instance, are rather bawdy. And her son, Micheál, was frequently giving out to her for using certain phrases and expressions that she had, Béaloidis, Joe Daly said. And she had a great sense of humour. Like, it bubbles through her storytelling. For instance, in that book right there are 21 instances in the telling of the stories in which Peg laughs and gets the listeners to laugh with her. Like, so she had a great sense of humour. Hers was one of the houses the children used to come to play. She loved music, and the music was played in her house. And that is one sort of way in which I think we can look at Peg today. In other words, see her as a more rounded person. Certainly she was a woman who had suffered a lot. Certainly she is a woman who has shown us what the traditional attitudes to harsh fate is and how she was enabled to deal with this. But that shouldn't lead us to think that she was sort of a gloomy, depressed kind of a person. So there was another side to her.
Well, I mean, I would really want us to see her as a great artist, and that's really what she was in the field of storytelling. I don't know how her reputation, how we can achieve that recognition for her. Now, there's no problem among folklorists and scholars and students of oral narrative and folk tales. Peg is going to be essential for them. There's no issue about the respect that she has in that niche community. I mean, in the wider world of Ireland, where she has been denigrated for about 3 or 4 decades because of, for all kinds of complex reasons. As we know, we don't have to go into them. I mean, she's this whole mixture of emotions going on in the anti-Peg trope that has taken legs and is just out there, but it may be getting weaker now. So, I mean, the task of kind of re-educating the Irish public about Peg, I think certain initiatives are going to make a difference, and that the exhibition in Molly is going to be one of them, and this podcast and the books that Pádraig O'Héalaí and Boo have brought out over the Lara Lecoq and Neil Dara Rota, which, present some a small selection of Peg stories to the public in Gaeilge and in translation, so that they're accessible, will help to help people to reevaluate her and to kind of recognise her for the genius that she was. That's what I hope would be happening to Peg. She deserves to be recognised. She deserves to be acknowledged, and she deserves to be known again now, as she was in the early days of the century, as a really important artist.
Yeah, the problem is, I suppose, that the genres of art that she was master of, they're no longer popular. People don't listen to international folk tales or tales of the supernatural.
Yes, we have to find a way of... people don't listen to long Fianna tales and fairy tales on Sunday nights. They watch, TV drama and Netflix, which will be using plenty of the same tropes and ideas that are in the stories and have the same structures. But I think the modern storyteller movement, and we have a storyteller, Nuala Hayes, who's part of that revival, and Nuala is working on a Peg project as we speak, and we have have to find creative ways of, of telling the stories in a way that makes them interesting and entertaining. Like, to be honest, I love the stories, but that's because I'm kind of analysing them. It's a lot of fun if you're a researcher and a folklorist, but I think you have to find quite creative ways to kind of get them across as entertainments. But there are ways, and the new storytellers are finding ways of doing that.
Indoctrinating the public, ways of
re-indoctrination.
Re-indoctrination camps, finally. I want to go back to, we'll give the last word to Peg here. Well, not more anyway. When the fun is at its height, it's time to go, runs the Irish proverb. And when visitors went each night, Peg would draw the ashes over the peat embers to preserve the fire till morning, reciting her customary prayer. I preserve the fire as Christ preserves all, Bridget at the two ends of the house and Mary in the centre. The three angels and the three apostles who are highest in the kingdom of grace, guarding this house and its contents until day. It's hard to be growing old, said Peg, when I said goodbye to her in Dingle. But, she added with a grin, I'll be talking after my death, my good gentleman. So she will, for as the proverb says, Is buin a pert na glór na nain, is buin a fuckle na ticket na tail. A tune is more lasting than the song of the birds, and a word more lasting than the wealth of the world. So our story here is coming to a close, but before we finish up, I'd like to give special thanks to Simon and Ben and Katie here at Molly for their hospitality and kindness in inviting us to record the podcast here and for looking after us all so well. And indeed, special thanks is due to yourselves for being with us here this evening. And finally, I'd like, if you give a round of applause, please, to thank our guests for all that they've shared this evening. Please thank Éilís and Pádraig.